This is Josh Patrick, and you're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. And my guest today is Jonathan Goldhill. And we'll bring up a thing that says, here we go. Uh, and you can find John at the Goldhill Group. And he is an expert in working with family businesses in the construction world. Happens to be something I loved also. So we're going to start there. And I hope we have a great little conversation. So we'll bring John on. Hey, John, how are you today?
Thanks so much for having me on the show. Pretty excited to be here. Just
It's
just coming
nice
back
to
from
be.
the holiday, yeah. So it's great.
Yeah. We're just coming back from the holiday, even though this won't be going live in the podcast till well into February because
Okay,
I
all
like
right.
doing things way in advance. So, John, you were an expert with family businesses and specifically in the construction world. So, what do you see as the biggest challenge that construction companies have to create a business that rewards them economically and they have a lot of fun running?
So I think that probably the biggest challenge is that most business owners in general, Josh, don't really have a playbook to run their business by. Um, Business can be really daunting if you don't have a playbook. A playbook provides, let's call it, you can call it a framework, an operating system, a playbook. It provides an understanding about how we're going to do things around here. That includes how we're going to have meetings, what types of meetings, how they're going to be structured. It includes how we're going to track measures to see how well we're performing against our business plan. It means that we're actually going to periodically, like quarterly and annually, step away from the business to look at how we've done and to have a plan, put a plan in place for the next 90 days and for the next year and 3 years. So I think that the lack of these types of systems in too many blue collar construction businesses causes them to basically run around kind of like, they say chickens with their head cut off, without real clarity about, like, where are we trying to get to? What's the target? What does success look like? What does a successful employee look like? And how do we know how do they know if they're having a good day, week, month, year? So having these types of systems in place, I find really make the difference between a company that's doing good and a company that's doing great, or a company that is overworked, overwhelmed, exhausted, and a company that looks like they've got it all together. And it's not the
So
company, it's the people, right?
I want to step in here for a second because most of the time, and this is my experience anyhow,
Hmm.
in the trades, and especially in the subcontractor trades, these guys essentially are tradespeople.
Hmm. Yep.
If they start the business from scratch, it's not like, they went and got an MBA from Stanford and then said, gee, the construction business sounds like a great place to be. Typically, it's an electrician that's working for somebody, gets annoyed at their employer, says, I can do it better, breaks off on their own, starts doing some work. And before they know it, they have 3, 4, 5, 6 people in their crew. And they're just stealing their, wiring places or putting lights up. And they never
Hmm.
get around to really figuring out how to run a business. So,
Right.
what triggers them to go from being tradespeople to business owners?
So I think when they kind of recognize that they're stuck and they've hit a ceiling, and what does that look like? Excuse me. Maybe they're out in the field way too many hours when they need to be in the office doing some paperwork or administration. Maybe they don't like that part of the work, which is going into the office, looking at books and finances and HR and all those policies and procedures and structure. I mean, but they tend to get stuck. They plateau at a certain level of sales. They have maybe a frequent turnover of people. Um, they have lots of issues out at the job site, rework, lack of good communication. I mean, if they're not enjoying the journey of business ownership, if their dream of being an entrepreneur turns into a little bit of a nightmare, and they're having restless nights sleeping, then it really didn't quite work out to the way they wanted it to work out. And that's when I think it's really clear that like they need to do something different, and they need to, if they're going to stay, just because they're good at plumbing or electrical work, sadly, it doesn't mean that they're good at running a plumbing or electrical business. They're two very different sets of skills, right? One really requires a master technician. The other really requires someone who's a leader, someone who understands marketing and finance and operations, and has the ability to create a followership. Very different. So,
So you've recently written a book called The Disruptive Successor.
mhm.
So, what do you mean by the disruptive successor? I find that fascinating just because we do a lot of work also with what I call the rising generation, which is younger, the kids of the business owner, typically second generation, rarely third generation, but typically second generation. And I'm assuming that your book is kind of talking about how the successor can be disruptive and successful.
Yep,
But
exactly.
if I'm wrong, what's the book about?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's about a next generation leader in a family business who wants to take what his mother or father built that was probably largely built by a technician. Maybe they built $1 million company, maybe a $2 million company, but probably not that much more because it's way too dependent currently on the owner's knowledge. It's a very owner dependent versus a very systems dependent business. And so the disruptive successor is coming from a generation, a younger generation, typically millennial, who's more business oriented and business minded than people of your age and my age growing up. I don't know probably about you, but most people I know were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. They were fighting the system. They were not like capitalist business minded. They were not going to business school. The younger generation, it's all about they're very business minded. They understand marketing and social media, and so the disruptive successor really wants to take the business and 2 to 10x that business, and he's got to potentially wrestle it away from the parent, or preferably, have a gentle, peaceful transition of ownership and of power and control and authority. And in order to do that, the disruptive successor needs to prove to their parent or the prior generation that they've developed the skills, they've got the knowledge, perhaps they have the coach that's going to back them up, and that they've got a playbook that is going to change the way the business is currently being run. And then the parent has to be okay and see that they're safe, they trust their child. The child isn't going to bet the farm, and so that the 60, 70-year-old parent is going to suddenly find themselves not having the income, the lifestyle that they currently have, but it's going to be made better. And so the disruptive successor is someone who thoughtfully improves the business by disrupting the status quo.
So, my experience with that, and I think you're absolutely correct, by the way, for those who are listening, in your senior generation, this is what's going to happen when you try to bring your kids in, if you try to bring your kids in. But the same thing's going to happen if you bring managers in versus kids, because in the construction world, your business is not very saleable.
Yes.
The transfer of the business will likely be to your children. And if not your children, some key people in your business, or you're just going to shut it down at the end of the day, because the truth is nobody wants to buy it.
Right.
So the big question I have is, or I'm curious about what you run across with this, is that junior starts making some changes, senior hates the changes because it's different. How do you get senior to back off and say, understand what you did worked and it worked great because you were a startup, but you're not a startup anymore. It's a different skill set.
Well, I mean, one thing you can do, obviously, is approach it from a financial perspective. and let's look at objectively what the valuation of the business was at the time that Junior took over the business, and what is it today. If the value has been increased, then arguably the parent has got to defer that the child has grown the business and it's more valuable. Now, let's say the business offers the opportunity to create some recurring revenue. So we take it from a construction type business, which, my friends in the IT world who are doing that similar type of work, they might call that a break fix build business model versus a subscription business model where there's a maintenance income stream that's recurring and reliable. Now that makes a business more sellable and more valuable. So if these subcontractors or tradespeople can create subscription level agreements where they come out and do maintenance work and they get recurring income, that's going to make the business more valuable. So looking at it from a value standpoint, there's some different ways that we can measure value. And then I think the owner, or let's just say again, the parent, looks at it and says, what's the quality of my life? Am I having more free time? Am I having more time to go golf or go on vacation? Am I having more disposable income? Is my income actually stream safer? Am I able to take less of an income and enjoy a larger dividend or distribution? So these are all things that would suggest that the value of the business, again, is greater. So I think that, people generally have two concerns, time and money. So are they having more and better quality time? And have they bought back time for themselves? Have they created more money, more wealth, more opportunity, more exit opportunities?
So I've got another thing for you to consider, because this has been my experience with literally every rising generation. And I don't care what industry we're in,
Mm-hmm.
is that when I come into working with a company, I find that the rising or the junior generation generally has what I would call and their parents would call an employee mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And probably the biggest thing that they have to overcome is the second hardest thing that they'll ever do in business, in my opinion, but is to make that transition from an employee mentality to an owner's mentality. Do you find that exists with the people you work with also?
I don't, unless the parent is the one who hired me. So if the parent hired me and says, I really want you to coach Junior, my child,
Right.
and I oftentimes find that maybe I don't see this too much, but maybe there's an entitlement mentality in the next generation, and or they don't work as hard, or they're not as smart, or they're not as driven, or they're working more for a paycheck. I don't find that person to be particularly coachable. They're not what I call a disruptive successor. They're not even what I would call a next generation leader. I just think they're the next generation of the company. And the owner's got to decide, does my son or daughter or children, do they have the wherewithal to really run this business? Can they make it at least as good as I've made it for myself? And they have done, and it has to be an understanding that, look, if you're bringing more families into the business, there's going to be more mouths to feed. And so if you're running a business and have been running it with 10 people, and now you have, an heir that is going to be joining the business and running it, well, you're probably going to need to scale to 20 people because it's not going to provide enough income otherwise for the two families. So I think that if entitlement or a lack of ambition is in that next generation, then the end of the business is nearer in sight, unless that person can overcome that.
Yeah, my experience is there's ways to get them to overcome it. And most of it, the biggest thing that we do that makes a big difference with folks is how we compensate them.
Mm,
Whereas most of the time, children working in a business get a paycheck,
Yep.
and they focus on that paycheck because that's where they get their money from.
Hmm.
But what we've been doing is we've been putting together a bonus plan
Hmm.
where at least 30, maybe 50%, sometimes as high as 70% of the money they make is based on the success of the business. So that automatically changes their focus from themselves to the business. Now, to make that transition is usually 18 months or so
Hmm.
because there's a lot of fighting that goes back and forth because I was making all this money and now I don't can't count on it. And you have to make that transition if you're ever going to become an owner of a company, in my opinion.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think if you can do that successfully, then you have a great case study for a successful transition. Um, Truthfully, I think that if we could turn all of our businesses into pay for performance positions, then all of our businesses would be more successful. And I think that to drive that ownership mentality into your employees is so powerful. I think they're doing a really good job at the Great Game of Business, which is a
Yep.
training ground for this type of work. I think the book, The Great Game of Business, is a great book for just getting the mindset right around how to have more ownership thinking at the employee level. And it requires a lot of education and training, um, maybe a little bit of business school 101 on finances and things like that. Uh, so I think that's really powerful, Josh. If you can get that next generation leader to really work for their pay, then I think you can create an ownership mentality.
Yeah, it's worked several times for me. And if we can't do it, or we can't get the parent to say, this is what we're going to do, we're likely going to have a fail with that rising generation. They
Hmm.
have to be thinking about the success of the company more than the success of themselves. And the easiest way to do that, and by the way, you're absolutely correct. I used to own a vending and food service company,
Hmm.
and we were practitioners of open book management in 1984, which is
Hmm.
a few years ago.
Hmm.
And I can tell you that by going to open book management, where everybody is on one bonus plan based on points, which I won't get into because it's too long of a conversation, but it the perfect way to get your employees to start thinking about your business, and their compensation is based on the business, not what they do individually.
Yeah,
It's a
so
really good thing to
powerful.
do. Yeah.
100%. So
And
powerful. And I think really, we should look at all the positions in our company and see if we can effectuate that kind of a compensation structure. And it's, people throw their hands up and like, well, how am I going to compensate the receptionist based on the number of calls or how quickly they answer the call? I mean, maybe you don't need to get down to that level, but you certainly need to look at the efficiency of your managers, the efficiency of your laborers, and start measuring things, labor effectiveness, management effectiveness. So, how many dollars of gross margin or contribution margin are they generating? So pay them
so
accordingly if you can.
So, John, we have time for one more topic, and
Sure.
you actually hit on it when you first came on, and it sort of ties into what we're talking about right now, which is creating a dashboard.
Hmm.
In my opinion, that's almost the first thing we always do with people is we help them create a dashboard so they can focus on the things that drive their business and are not especially historical, except how much cash they have on hand.
Correct.
Um, So, what kind of things do you measure with your construction companies that help them understand what's going to happen in the future?
Well, I think actually two measures that not enough of my clients do measure is labor effectiveness
Yeah.
and management effectiveness. Um, and that's basically if you want to learn more about that, I recommend people pick up the book Simple Numbers by Greg Crabtree and read about his labor effectiveness ratio and management effectiveness ratio, or watch some of the videos that you'll find on YouTube. But it's basically measuring the contribution margin dollars divided by, the management dollars or the direct labor dollars, and figure out exactly, what the ratio is, and how, what create some targets around that. So those are good, I think, leading indicators. Um, and I think gross profit is probably, or you could look at it contribution margin. The difference being that gross profit basically looks at your cost of goods sold as materials and labor, but
Yep.
contribution margin really separates out the labor. And I think that's really important because you don't have so much control over your raw materials prices if you're a contractor, right? I mean, lumber went through the roof during COVID. You didn't have so much control over that if you needed lumber or copper or whatever. But you do have control over your labor. And so you really ought to know how much you're making in terms of dollars for every dollar that you're spending in labor. And you could measure by, potentially you could do it by employee or by crew, or by region, or division. So I think those are some of the most important leading indicators that you ought to have in your dashboard. Those are operating measures. Of course, you'll need probably some marketing measures, although no contractors really seem to be too short on work these days. But you want to see if there's, are we starting to see a downturn? Maybe interest rates start rising, there's inflation, maybe construction starts slowing down. It's only a matter of time before that happens, because all things are cyclical in construction. So how many website inquiries are you getting? How many referral inquiries are you getting from your general contractors? How many bids are you submitting? I mean, those are all kind of leading indicators in the marketing arena. Your close rate, your conversion ratio, conversion by dollars, conversion by number of jobs. Those are all good, I think, marketing metrics that ought to be in your dashboard. So I think those are a few good ones.
Yeah, I'm going to add one more. I think that
Right.
measuring, by the way, all your stuff about labor efficiency is right on the money.
Mm-hmm.
We happen to we actually track production per hour
I
versus
like that one.
cost.
Yep.
And we want to know if it's costing me $30 an hour, I better be getting at least $90 an hour in production now. Otherwise, I'm not going to make any money.
I agree.
And
100%.
and in many trades, what you're seeing is the percent of labor is going up, and the percent of materials is going down in the work you do, because of, we're in a weird place now where materials are going through the roof. But for
Mm-hmm.
many years, we're going the other direction. They're
Mm-hmm.
getting cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that I like to measure is backlog, because backlog tells me if I'm going to have a problem 90 days down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. I mean, I also like, since we're talking about cash, this is cracking the cash flow code. I think you ought to measure your net working capital and know how
Yes.
much do you have. Again, Greg Crabtree talks about it in terms of a core capital target. He's found historically that most companies need 2, maybe 2.5 months of operating capital. So I think it's really important to measure what is your net working capital. And that's basically measured current assets minus current liabilities. How much money do you have before you run out of cash? And
Yes.
is that changing? Like, so if customers are starting to pay more slowly, or you're not as good at your collections, then you'll start to notice some erosion in your cash position. And you can literally grow yourself out of business, as I'm sure you know, and others maybe don't understand that whole concept.
I actually almost did it 3 times. So
So you get it pretty clearly.
I get it
Yeah.
pretty. I was a slow learner. Hey, John, unfortunately, we are out of time.
Okay.
And you've been really a great guest. And I'm going to guess that people listening to this podcast episode would love to find you. So how would they do so?
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Jonathan Goldhill. Connect with me, send me a message. I respond to all messages. You could also go to my website, thegoldhillgroup.com. That's Goldhill is my name, group.com. And we are going through a website makeover. but that's a good place for you to also schedule a complimentary consultation with me to talk about the issues, challenges that you're facing, some of the solutions that we use, and whether or not there's a fit between what I offer and what the needs of the business are.
Cool. And I have two things I would like you to do. The first one you've heard me say about 9 zillion times, which is please go and subscribe to the podcast and give us an honest rating review. If you love us, give us 5 stars. If you hate us, well, I hope you don't, but some people might. Then you'll have to just say you hate us, but please don't do it too badly. I might cry. And the second thing I would like you to do is I have published my second book. It's called The Sale Ready Company. It's a continuation with our friends at the Aardvark family. And this time we're getting ready, or John's getting ready to transfer his business. And there are all sorts of questions, all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems that we get to deal with in the book. And the truth is, it's what happens in almost every family business I've ever run across. And I don't care what industry it is. This happens to be a manufacturing company. So it's really easy to get. I'm actually selling it for half price off my website, so you can get it for $7.95. If you go to www.sustainablebusiness.com, that's www.sustainablebusiness.com, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of the book. I'll even sign it. So this is Josh Patrick with John Goldhill. You're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. Thanks a lot for stopping by. I hope to see you back here